Hi there. We're here once again with Dr. Clif Lewis, organizational psychologist, and we're going to have another discussion on how AI is affecting the workplace and organizational culture. Today, we're going to talk about a framework, a popular framework in organizational psychology, and discuss how this framework is being disrupted through the advent of artificial intelligence. Hi, Clif. Very nice to see you.
Hi, Stelios. Always good to chat with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. So would you like maybe to share a few words about the Edgar Schein's framework of organizational culture? And I guess then we can discuss about how artificial intelligence is affecting that space.
Sure. So if you've done any work in either organization studies or organizational leadership, you would likely have come across Edgar Schein's model of organizational culture. It's one of those seminal pieces of work that kind of stood the test of time. He started his work in this space in the 80s, I think, and he recently passed away, but at a ripe old age, and we're still using this model. So maybe I can contextualize it in terms of what I've seen on the internet and on LinkedIn specifically. I've seen quite a bit of people starting to interrogate how we understand and talk about organizational culture. And this model, and it kind of resonates with this model because I've seen quite a few posts where people say, free lunches is not organizational culture. Gym memberships is not organizational culture, which is correct, which is definitely in line with the more critical approach to organizational culture, where you don't just want to slap a whole bunch of nice things onto the workday. But then the next step from there is then people who post that would then just put some other kind of thing that's slapped onto the workday as organizational culture without realizing it. And so if we use Schein's model with the three levels, the things that people are talking about when they post those types of comments on LinkedIn or other parts of social media, what they're referring to is the top level, the artifacts. And so organizational culture culture in general is essentially patterns in how people interact with each other and their environment. And that's the part that is visible. And so it's not entirely correct that organizational culture isn't free lunches or gym memberships or whatever else. It's just not only that. So when you talk about organizational culture artifacts, I think actually the image says so. It's that, So from what the building looks like to the software that we use, to our uniforms, to the way we schedule meetings, the stuff that we can see. And the important thing about organizational culture is if you only look at artifacts, you are going to affect temporary change. If you want to, I'm assuming that you want to change or develop your organizational culture. And this is very important when we talk about AI, because if you just adopt, I don't know, I'm not an AI specialist, a specific type of AI, you purchase a specific type of AI service or something to use for your people to maybe increase their productivity or whatever the case might be. That's only at an artifact level. If you want to have an organizational culture that is open to new disruptions brought about by AI, if you want people to be open to use AI, if you want people to use AI consistently, you want a culture that encourages people to stick with it and not just have something and then abandon it later, which is often what happens, then you have to go deeper. And the deeper parts are less visible, and they're also more difficult to pin down and more difficult to change. And so that's the espoused values and the underlying assumptions. Now, I've already said a lot. I don't know, do you want to interject or maybe ask a question specifically maybe as it pertains to AI?
Yeah, actually, I have a question. when I first looked at this, I had some ideas around how AI is going to disrupt this model. For example, the artifacts. This picture says the data is easy to collect, but difficult to interpret. And for those of you who are not watching the video and who are just on audio, this is a pyramid. So there are 3 levels. At the bottom is the underlying assumptions, then it's the espoused values, and then at the top, it's the artifacts. The artifacts is the visible environment of a firm, including its architecture, technology, office layout, and more. I think that maybe this statement that it's difficult to interpret is no longer true, because maybe we're in a stage where AI, or we're going to soon be in a stage, makes this interpretation more accessible, as well as when we go down to espoused values. So espoused values is the reasons and rationalizations for why members behave the way they do in an organization. And this often requires key members of an organization getting interviewed, right? So again, it could be the case that AI can parse through documents and emails, and while preserving privacy, it can essentially unlock, the cultural values of a company based on conversation. So where I'm going with this is I think that the AI probably lowers the barriers to entry for studying each one of those pillars, the artifacts, the espoused values, and even the underlying assumptions, even though maybe the underlying assumptions are not stated clearly as much, which means that maybe it's more difficult for an AI to capture that. Now, what I don't know is how this model is applied in practice, right? So if, for example, an organizational psychologist wanted to study the espoused values, I would presume that the psychologist would use something like a questionnaire. This is where AI can actually speed up the process. So I don't know what's like the standard way of operating under these types of frameworks, right? So how do you approach these types of this model in practice?
Sure. So the staying power of this model is that it's not really a prescriptive model. It's more of it's not even a descriptive model. It's more of a lens, or it's more of a lens to look at organizations. And so even if the context, as I mentioned, like Shine's work started in the 80s, even though the work context has changed drastically, us as humans and how we interact with each other has stayed more consistent. And so that's what makes this, and so something like AI wouldn't necessarily disrupt this model. But as you say, yes, I do think, because the comments on the right side, the data is easy to collect, or might require interviews. That's specifically with regards to if you want to do research, if you want to study organizational culture. If you want to change organizational culture, you probably, organizational culture, you probably would have to do the same. I definitely think, I haven't actually thought about using AI in research. You mentioning it now is actually triggering quite a few ideas. My thinking around this has always been, how do we use models or knowledge on organizational culture to make organizations more receptive to AI and technological disruption? But yes, definitely, if you want to collect evidence on espoused values and even more difficult underlying assumptions, yes, you can do surveys, you can do interviews, but you can also do focus groups. You can also do like more ethnographic research, where you observe almost as an outsider, observe how people interact with each other and with their work, and how they do their work, and their how they function in that space. Definitely, I think my knowledge about AI and how it works is limited, but I definitely think that, yes, I would be careful though. I don't know how the sort of super hardcore AI works and what is possible, but for example, I have a paid ChatGPT account, so I'm able to use the GPT-4 model, which is obviously more sophisticated than the free one, the GPT-3. And I still have quite a bit of difficulty getting it to do what I want it to do. And I don't think my prompts are bad. I think my prompts are actually quite specific and detailed and good. So if we want to deploy AI to do organizational culture research, as opposed to what I came into this conversation thinking, that how do we get the right culture to embrace AI? Yes, the answer is yes. I think there is a lot of opportunity, and I should probably get on that train as soon as possible, while it's still popular. I just don't know how. I'm not entirely sure how one would apply that because I don't know AI as well as you.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the whole purpose of this exercise, right? So I
Yeah.
think, and I think there are a few angles to it, right? One hand is how can we, how can, for example, any type of knowledge worker, like in this particular case, an organizational psychologist, use AI? On the other hand, yes,
Mm,
this might give this podcast might give some product ideas to some people. But from this conversation, I do feel that AI, and that's like a general trend, not only around organizational psychology, makes processing,
mm,
data processing easier in a way, but actually
mm,
much easier. There might be even professions like data analysts, even data scientists that are going to be disrupted. But at the same
mm,
time, I think that in terms of changing organizational culture, then that's like a different
mm,
matter altogether. Now, another question is if an organization was going to adopt AI, according to this model, and again, for the sake of those who are listening, at the bottom, we have underlying assumptions, then espoused values, and then artifacts. Where this organization would start, right? So my feeling is that the underlying assumptions are difficult to change. So and
yes.
artifacts is the easiest thing to change. So if an organization, for
Yes.
example, is very tech friendly, then adopting AI, it's just easier saying, hey, just a new artifact. However, it feels like
Mm,
many organizations, especially big and old organizations and firms, they're going to get stuck at the middle layer, the espoused values. And changing this, I guess it's going to take some effort. And the question is, okay, how are you changing your
mm,
values to use AI? What is AI about? Is it about
mm,
firing people and then replacing them with AI? Is it about
mm.
giving people the freedom to have more options in their lives? Do we give them like more free time? For example, yesterday I interviewed Christos Makerdis, an economist, a US-based economist, and he did some research in how AI and remote work is changing the relationship we have with our work. And he found a pattern that it looks like AI and remote working translates to a small increase in leisure time, at least according to his findings. Which
Mm-hmm.
obviously, if your values are around quality of life, that's a very positive outcome. If the corporate values of an organization are around, oh, you should work 90 hours a week, then maybe that's a negative outcome. So what's your
Yeah.
opinion on that? I realize I touched upon quite a few subjects at the same
Yes.
time.
Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud now, but the first one that you mentioned, so I think AI and culture, if we use Shine's model and we look at the middle layer, the espoused values, and I think it's if you want to adopt, if you want to create the culture that is open to AI and general technological disruptions, but you also want to use AI to identify or diagnose your organizational culture. It's kind of like a chicken and egg situation because I don't know if you've maybe noticed, but in February, every company is celebrating Black History Month by slapping stuff on their company logo and putting stuff um, on their website. In June, everybody's wearing Pride lanyards. But there's very little evidence that very little evidence that actual values support those initiatives. And so what you find is people are talking about rainbow washing, greenwashing is another one when it comes to sustainability, one specific week or day or month out of the year when it's trendy. So because values is something that you can't just tell someone to do like an artifact or give someone, and because it is so difficult to identify what the values are, I think AI offers a really incredible opportunity to actually cut through the BS. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on your podcast.
Feel free,
s-
no censoring.
yeah, because there's so much bullshit around organizational culture and organizational values that support that culture. I think if you, and you mentioned this episode might actually give people some product ideas. I think if we had some kind of value diagnosis where you give the AI access to certain things, and then it'll tell you, listen, you said that you support trans people during Pride Month, but based on the massive amounts of data that this AI was able to analyze, your values definitely does not support that. So at best, you have trans supporting artifacts in your organization, but you don't have values that support them. And the net result of that will be the next month, when it's not trendy and everyone's not talking about it anymore on social media, then we're going to forget about those things. We're not going to have any policies in place. We're not going to make sure that we protect people or do the things that we committed to doing. And it's the same about assumptions. Now, assumptions are incredibly difficult to change, because assumptions is literally about how you see the world, and something like a worldview is something that develops over many years. And the other difficult part is everyone in the organization, just because we work for the same organization, you could maybe coax people into adopt certain values, because usually what you find is that organizational values in an org are usually quite generic. So it'll be like, we care for people, we value excellence, these types of things. But how we see the world, that's very difficult to change. And just because we work for the same organization doesn't necessarily mean that we have the same assumptions. Now, two people or two different groups might have different assumptions about the world that they live in, but both of those assumptions might support specific set of values, which then support specific artifacts, which then can create a desired organizational culture. So it's not to say that it's not like a linear line. It's a little bit more complex than the pyramid diagram. But while that is possible, that it doesn't have to be a very rigid alignment between the three layers. When there is required intervention, the intervention is usually at a value and an assumptions level. But that takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of commitment. And it's usually the biggest impact and the biggest change usually comes from making the hard choice, or making the hard decision, choosing the more difficult outcome. For example, an easy example is a top performer who's toxic in the workplace. So say you've got a sales team, they're I don't know what the metaphor is that we use, piranhas, bulldogs, whatever. A thing that bites takes a big bite out of market share. They get all the sales, they make all the sales, but everyone that works with them is absolutely in tears every time they have to engage with them. And so if you have I don't know, artifacts like employee wellness program, that means that a value that you should have is maybe caring for people. But if you allow a toxic top performer to just leave terror and horror everywhere they go, as long as they make the sales, then your value is, then you likely didn't have a value, or your organization or top leadership likely didn't have a value of care. The artifact of an employee wellness program is more for to avoid legal risk, to say, well, if we get sued because some employee had maybe a setback or something at work as a direct result of the toxic work environment, and they get sued, they can say, oh, well, we've got evidence here. And so that artifact isn't actually based on the value that we think it is. And that's a long story to say what I said before, changing values and changing assumptions is very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. But it looks like AI, at least, is making it easier to maybe track some of those values and assumptions. which I guess makes for a very interesting next topic. I guess we have to go because I have another call in 4 minutes, but it's been a pleasure as always.
Likewise, I hope my babbling was at least a little bit beneficial for your listeners.
100%, Cliff. Cool. So thanks, everyone. Make sure to check out datascientist.com as well Tesseract.academy for more content on AI and blockchain. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.